The cold was a thief. It crept through the window frames of Sarah's tiny rental, stealing the thin warmth generated by the last 3 logs in the fireplace. It stole the feeling from her fingertips as she counted the bills on the kitchen table for the 10th time. $17.42. Enough for a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, and maybe a small can of beans. Not enough to silence the gnawing anxiety that had become her constant companion. Outside, the world had vanished into a swirling vortex of white. The blizzard, the worst in a decade, had descended upon the small mountain town of Havenwood with a vindictive fury, burying streets, snapping power lines, and isolating everyone in their own little boxes of survival. Sarah's box was colder than most. The landlord's letter, crisp and cruel under the flickering candlelight, served as a stark reminder of her precarity. Final notice. Eviction proceedings to commence in 72 hours. 72 hours felt like a lifetime and no time at all. Her son, 7-year-old Leo, was asleep in the next room, bundled in every blanket they owned. His quiet, trusting breaths were the only sound besides the howling wind and the sputtering fire. For him, the storm was an adventure, a day off from school. For Sarah, it was a tightening vice. She looked through the frosted pane of her kitchen window, across the snow-choked street to Mrs. Gable's house. It was a beacon of warmth and judgment, its windows glowing with amber light, a generator humming softly in the background. Sarah could almost feel the older woman's gaze, a mixture of pity and disapproval that had followed her ever since her husband, Mark, had been brought home from overseas under a folded flag. The town saw her as a charity case, a tragic figure who couldn't quite manage. They didn't see the 18-hour days she'd once worked, the nursing degree she'd put on hold, the fierce, unyielding love for her son that fueled every weary step. They just saw the peeling paint on her porch and the perpetual worry in her eyes. The fire popped, sending a shower of dying embers onto the hearth. A profound sense of hopelessness washed over her. It felt like the cold wasn't just outside. It was inside, freezing her spirit, crystallizing her despair. Then came a sound that didn't belong. A heavy, rhythmic thud against her front door, nearly lost in the gale. It wasn't the wind. It was a fist, a desperate human fist. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Her first instinct was pure, primal fear. No one should be out in this. The sheriff had issued a strict stay-at-home order hours ago. Who would be knocking on her door? The last house on a dead-end street, in the middle of a blizzard. Her mind, conditioned by the town's whispers and her own vulnerability, conjured images of desperate criminals, vagrants driven mad by the cold. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a cast-iron skillet, its weight a pathetic comfort against the unknown. Leo stirred in his room. "Mommy?" His small voice called out, laced with sleep. "It's nothing, sweetie. Go back to sleep," she whispered, her voice trembling. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. It was followed by a low groan that the wind almost swallowed. It wasn't the sound of aggression. It was the sound of utter defeat. Against every screaming instinct for self-preservation, another, deeper instinct took over. The one that had driven her to nursing school. The one that saw suffering and felt an irresistible pull to soothe it. She took a deep breath, held the skillet tight, and unbolted the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall. And there, framed in the doorway, was a monster, or what looked like one. He was immense, a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders filling the entire frame. A thick, grizzled beard, caked with ice, covered the lower half of his face. He wore a heavy leather jacket, emblazoned with a demonic, winged skull, but it was stiff with frozen snow. His face, what she could see of it, was a ghastly shade of blue-gray, his lips cracked and pale. He swayed on his feet, his eyes barely open, and then he collapsed, not forward, but sideways, slumping against the doorframe and sliding into a heap on her porch, half in and half out of the storm. For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed. The insignia on his jacket screamed Hell's Angels. Everything she'd ever heard about them, the violence, the crime, the danger, flashed through her mind. This was the town's boogeyman, manifest on her doorstep. He was the embodiment of everything a woman alone with her child should fear. But then she saw the shivers racking his massive frame, tremors so violent they seemed seismic. She saw the frost forming on his eyebrows. He wasn't a monster, he was a man, and he was dying. The skillet clattered to the floor. The nurse in her, the part of her she thought had died with her dreams, took over. She grabbed his arm, the leather cold and unyielding as stone, and pulled. It was like trying to move a fallen oak. "Hey, can you hear me? You have to get inside," she yelled over the wind. He moaned, a sound from deep in his chest, but didn't move. Adrenaline surged through her. She couldn't leave him there. She put her shoulder under his armpit, braced her feet, and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. He was dead weight, an anchor of ice and leather. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the threshold until his entire body was inside. She kicked the door shut against the raging storm, the latch catching with a reassuring click. The sudden silence was deafening. He lay on her threadbare rug, a frozen giant melting into a puddle on her floor. His breathing was shallow, ragged. Hypothermia. Severe. She knew the signs. She knelt beside him, her hands, clumsy with cold and fear, going to the zipper of his jacket. It was frozen solid. As she struggled with it, her eyes fell on a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of Mark, his arm around her, both of them young and smiling, full of a future that would never come. He had died in a dusty, foreign land, far from home, relying on the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of his brothers in arms. He had always told her, "You judge a person not by the patch on their sleeve, but by the heart in their chest." He'd lived by a code of honor, a belief that you never leave a man behind, no matter who he is. That memory, sharp and painful, solidified her resolve. She ran to the kitchen and came back with a kettle of lukewarm water, pouring it carefully over the zipper until the ice gave way. She peeled the frozen jacket off him. Underneath, he wore a simple thermal shirt, soaked through. His skin was shockingly cold to the touch. This was a man who had faced down the worst of the storm and lost. As she worked, stripping away his wet clothes and covering him with the blankets from her own bed, leaving only one for herself and Leo, fragments of her own past surfaced. She remembered the long nights in nursing school, studying diagrams of the circulatory system, memorizing the subtle signs of a body shutting down. She'd been at the top of her class, driven by a fierce desire to heal. Then Mark's death, the crippling grief, and the sudden, crushing reality of being a single parent with no support system had forced her to drop out, just one semester shy of her degree. The textbooks were still in a box in the attic, monuments to a life she'd almost had. Tending to the stranger felt like reaching back for that forgotten part of herself, a muscle memory of competence and care kicking in through the fog of her fear. The pressure mounted with every tick of the clock. The last of the firewood was in the hearth, its flames a pathetic defense against the Arctic air seeping into the house. The temperature was dropping steadily. She had managed to get the biker into a dry set of Mark's old sweats, which were comically small on his massive frame. She'd propped him up near the fire, his head resting on a pillow. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his shivering replaced by a dangerous lethargy, his words slurred and nonsensical. "Brothers road gotta," he'd murmur, his eyes unfocused. Sarah knew she was in a race against time. Her own resources were perilously thin. The soup she had simmering on the camp stove was the last of their food until she could get to the store, a prospect that seemed weeks away. It was supposed to be breakfast and lunch for her and Leo tomorrow. Every log she put on the fire was one less barrier between her son and the biting cold that would settle in once the flames died. A new fear began to creep in, more insidious than the threat of the man himself. What if Mrs. Gable had seen her drag him inside? The image of the sheriff's car, its lights flashing against the snow, filled her with dread. How would she explain this? A single mother, a known member of a notorious biker gang in her house. They wouldn't see an act of compassion. They would see poor judgment, recklessness. They would see a reason to question her fitness as a mother. The thought made her feel colder than the wind outside. She checked on Leo. He was a small lump under a pile of blankets, his face peaceful. He was her whole world, the reason she fought so hard, the reason she endured the town's pity and the landlord's threats. Was she endangering him? Was this stranger, this outlaw, worth risking everything for? She looked back at the man by the fire. His face, in the flickering light, seemed less monstrous now. The harsh lines were softened, and a vulnerability she hadn't seen before was etched around his eyes. He wasn't a symbol of a gang. He was just a man, far from his own family, freezing to death on her floor. In that moment, the what-ifs and the judgments of the outside world faded away. There was only the here and now, a human life hanging in the balance, and her ability, however limited, to help. The choice was simple, and it had been made the moment she opened the door. Her own fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The turning point was a quiet act, witnessed only by the dancing shadows on the wall and the sleepy eyes of her son, who had padded silently into the room. The biker began to shiver again, a deep, rattling quake that shook his whole body. He was mumbling, his voice a low rasp. "So cold." Sarah knew he needed to get warm from the inside out. His core temperature was dangerously low. Her gaze fell to the small pot on the camp stove. The vegetable soup. It was thin, made from the last of the canned tomatoes and a few withered carrots, but it was hot. It was life. Without a second's hesitation, she ladled the soup into her last clean bowl. She knelt beside him, lifting his heavy head and resting it on her lap. "Hey," she said softly, her voice steady. "You need to drink this. It will help." His eyes fluttered open. For a second, a flicker of awareness, of lucidity, passed through them. He looked at her, then at the steaming bowl, then at the small boy watching from the doorway. He seemed to understand the sacrifice. He tried to shake his head, a weak gesture of refusal. "The boy," he rasped. "He needs it more." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. "He's fine," she lied, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "There's plenty. Now drink." She held the spoon to his chapped lips, and he drank. She fed him the entire bowl, spoonful by spoonful, a slow, patient ritual in the heart of the storm. It felt like more than just giving him food. It was an offering of trust, a transference of her own meager warmth and hope. When the bowl was empty, she gently laid his head back down. The shivering began to subside, replaced by a more stable, even breathing. His skin, while still cold, had lost its deathly pallor. She took the thin blanket from her own shoulders and tucked it around him, adding it to the pile. Then she sat beside him, leaning against the wall, positioning herself between him and the draft from the door. She would be his windbreak. She sat there for hours as the fire died down to glowing embers and the room plunged into a deeper cold. She dozed off and on, her body aching, a deep chill settling into her bones. But she didn't move. She was a sentry, a guardian, holding a silent, solitary vigil for a stranger while the world outside raged, oblivious. Leo, seeing what his mother had done, retrieved his own favorite blanket, the one with the faded cartoon spaceships, and draped it over her shoulders before curling up at her feet, a small, warm presence in the cold, dark room. In the shared silence, an unspoken pact was sealed, a lesson in humanity passed from mother to son. The world was born again in pale, morning light. The wind had died, leaving behind a landscape of profound silence and sculpted snow. The first thing Sarah felt was the ache in her back. The second was the cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had settled in overnight. The fire was long dead, a pile of gray ash. She looked over at the biker. He was awake. He was watching her, his eyes clear and intelligent. The disorientation was gone, replaced by a calm, appraising stillness that was somehow more intimidating than his delirium. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movements slow and deliberate, the borrowed sweatpants straining at the seams. He looked around the small, sparse room, taking in the empty fireplace, the eviction notice on the table, the child sleeping at her feet. His gaze lingered on the empty soup pot. Finally, his eyes met hers. They were the color of slate, hard and weathered, but in their depths, she saw something she hadn't expected. A raw, undisguised gratitude that was almost painful to look at. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sarah just nodded, pulling the thin spaceship blanket tighter around her shoulders. She felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness. The poverty of her home felt laid bare under his steady gaze. Anyone would have done the same, she deflected, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, the word sharp and final. "They wouldn't have." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them that was more powerful than any words. He saw her. Not the town's charity case, not the grieving widow, but the woman who had sat vigil, who had given her last meal to a dangerous stranger. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity. He slowly got to his feet, a mountain uncoiling. He walked over to the table and picked up the eviction notice, reading it without comment. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along his cheek. He placed it back down carefully, then turned back to her. "What's your name?" "Sarah." "My name's Frank," he said. "My brothers call me Roadblock." He extended a hand, calloused and huge. She placed her small, cold hand in his, and he shook it gently, a gesture of profound respect. Then he walked to the corner of the room where his frozen jacket lay in a heap. He pulled a satellite phone from an inner pocket, its rugged casing looking impossibly futuristic in the rustic room. He punched in a number and held it to his ear, his back to her. His conversation was brief, his voice too low for her to make out the words, but she heard the clipped, authoritative tone. He gave what sounded like an address. Then he hung up. "They're coming," he said, turning to face her. "They'll be here in an hour." A fresh wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over Sarah. "They?" The sound started as a distant tremor, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, felt more than heard. It grew steadily, a crescendo of mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the snow-covered world. Leo woke up, his eyes wide, and scrambled to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted glass. "Mommy, look!" The entire town of Havenwood seemed to be holding its breath. Curtains twitched. Doors opened a crack. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, her arms wrapped tightly around her robe, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. Down Sarah's quiet, dead-end street they came. A river of black and chrome, flowing through the pristine white snow. Motorcycles, dozens of them, then scores, their engines roaring in a synchronized, deafening chorus. They were a legion, an occupying army. Hell's Angels in their full, intimidating regalia. They rode 2 by 2, their movements precise and disciplined, the winged skull on their backs a unified symbol of terrifying power. They filled the street, 100 strong, their presence sucking all the air and peace from the morning. They came to a halt in front of Sarah's little house, a formidable phalanx of leather, steel, and menace. The sudden silence after they cut their engines was even more menacing than the noise. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bikers just sat on their machines, a silent, staring jury. Sarah stood in her doorway, Leo clinging to her leg, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. She had invited the wolves in, and now the pack had arrived. Roadblock, Frank, stepped out onto the porch to stand beside her. A man at the front of the formation, distinguished by a president patch on his vest, dismounted. He was leaner than Roadblock, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. He walked toward the house, his boots crunching in the snow, the sound unnervously loud in the quiet. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his gaze sweeping over Sarah, then landing on Roadblock. "Roadblock," the president said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the snow. "You look like hell." "Feeling better, preacher?" Roadblock replied, his voice rough with emotion. And then, in front of the entire silent, watching town, the story unfolded. The neighbors, drawn by the spectacle, had begun to creep out of their houses, forming a silent, fearful audience at a safe distance. They watched as Roadblock spoke, his deep voice carrying in the still, cold air. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth, and its power was devastating. He told Preacher, and by extension, everyone within earshot, about his bike skidding out on a patch of black ice, about the long, stumbling walk through the blinding snow, the creeping numbness, the certainty that he was going to die alone in a ditch. His voice grew thick as he described the faint light in the window of the last house on the street, the last vestiges of his strength spent knocking on the door. He pointed a large, leather-gloved finger at Sarah, who stood frozen beside him. "This woman," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "This woman, with a kid to feed and nothing in her cupboards, pulled me from the storm." He described the warmth of the fire, the way she had stripped off his frozen clothes and covered him with her own blankets. His gaze drifted to the empty soup pot, still visible through the open door. "She had one small pot of soup for her and the boy. She gave it to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Mrs. Gable's hand went to her mouth. Roadblock wasn't finished. He gestured to the house itself, its peeling paint and sagging porch looking even more pathetic surrounded by the gleaming chrome of the motorcycles. "Look at this place. She's got nothing. The fire was dead this morning. It's freezing in there. There's an eviction notice on her table." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "She gave me everything she had, Preacher. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't care about the patch. She just saw a man freezing to death." He then revealed a detail that sent a shockwave through the bikers. Frank Roadblock Costello, was not just any member. He was the club's national sergeant-at-arms, a living legend within their world, a man revered for his loyalty and toughness, the enforcer of their sacred code. An attack on him was an attack on the entire brotherhood, and an act of kindness toward him was a debt the entire brotherhood would repay. Preacher listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Roadblock finished, a profound silence fell over the street. The president's gaze shifted to Sarah. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep and abiding respect. The town had seen a victim. The bikers saw a queen. The moment of recognition was not one of words, but of action. Preacher gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and the machine of the Hell's Angels roared to life, not with their engines but with purpose. It was a stunning display of organized, disciplined force. A group of bikers broke from the formation and headed for a large support truck that had quietly pulled up at the end of the street. They returned bearing not weapons but tools and supplies. A team of 4, led by a man whose vest identified him as Nails, a contractor in his other life, immediately set to work on Sarah's sagging porch, tearing out the rotten wood with swift efficiency. Another group began unloading cords of seasoned oak, stacking it neatly against the side of her house, a fortress of firewood that would last the entire winter. The doors of the truck opened further, revealing an almost comical abundance of groceries. Bikers formed a human chain, passing bags and boxes into the house. Canned goods, fresh produce, meat, milk, bread, diapers, and a giant teddy bear for Leo, who watched in wide-eyed wonder. Another biker, an electrician, went inside to inspect the faulty wiring, while a plumber descended into the crawlspace to fix the leaking pipe that had plagued Sarah for months. They moved with a quiet, focused energy, transforming her world before her very eyes. The town watched, stunned into silence. This wasn't the chaotic violence they expected. This was a ballet of reconstruction, a symphony of gratitude. Preacher walked up the steps, which were already being reinforced by Nails and his crew. He stopped in front of Sarah, who was speechless, tears streaming silently down her face. He held out a thick, white envelope. "This is for the landlord," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And for the next 6 months after that. Find a better place. Or stay. Your choice. The club is handling it." He didn't wait for a thank you. He reached up and began to unbutton his own vest, the cute that was the symbol of his identity, his history, his soul. He slid it off his shoulders. It was an act of such significance that every biker on the street stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. He gently, reverently, draped the heavy leather vest over Sarah's small shoulders. It enveloped her, smelling of leather, road dust, and gasoline. "No one in this town will ever bother you again," Preacher declared, his voice ringing with authority, loud enough for Mrs. Gable and every other neighbor to hear clearly. "You're under the protection of the Hell's Angels. You are family. Respect is earned. You earned this." He left the vest on her for a moment, a symbolic coronation, before taking it back and shrugging it on. In that single gesture, Sarah's entire world, and her place in it, had been irrevocably transformed. The rest of the day passed in a surreal dream. The bikers worked tirelessly, their gruff exteriors belying a surprising tenderness. They were fathers, brothers, and sons. One biker, a giant with tattooed teardrops on his face, spent an hour patiently showing Leo how to properly polish chrome on a Harley's fender, his deep voice a soft rumble as he explained the process. Another fixed Leo's broken bicycle. They didn't just repair her house. They infused it with a sense of security and warmth it had never known. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. The porch was solid, the roof patched, the plumbing silent, the pantry full. The house was warm, filled with the smell of fresh-cut wood and brewing coffee. As the sun began to dip below the snow-covered peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the street, the bikers began to pack up their tools. The townspeople, who had been watching from a distance all day, were no longer afraid. Their fear had been replaced by a quiet, humbled awe. They had witnessed an honor code they didn't understand, a display of loyalty that shamed their own quiet judgment. Mrs. Gable walked tentatively across the street, a freshly baked apple pie in her hands. She avoided Sarah's eyes, her face flushed with shame, and handed the pie to Preacher. "For the road," she mumbled. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and passed it to another biker. It was a small offering, a first step toward mending a community's quiet cruelty. Preacher approached Sarah one last time as she stood on her new porch, Leo by her side. He knelt down to Leo's level. "Your mom's a hero, kid. Don't you ever forget that." He then stood and looked at Sarah, a simple, respectful nod passing between them. No more words were needed. He turned and walked back to his bike. With a single-hand signal from Preacher, 100 engines ignited in a single, deafening explosion of sound. It wasn't a threat this time, it was a salute, a thunderous, roaring tribute to the quiet woman on the porch. Then, as one, they turned and rode away, their river of black and chrome flowing back out of town, leaving behind a silence that was now filled not with hopelessness, but with peace. Sarah stood there for a long time, wrapped in a warm blanket someone had left for her, watching the red taillights disappear into the twilight. The air was crisp and cold, but she didn't feel it. For the first time since Mark had died, she felt safe. She wasn't an outcast anymore. She wasn't a charity case. She was the woman who had sheltered a Hell's Angel, the woman who had earned their respect. She belonged to an unlikely, fierce, and loyal family now. The roar of the engines faded completely, but the echo of their respect would linger over Havenwood forever.